before anyone raises their voice, before accusations fly, before emotions completely spiral out of control. This story begins with something far more dangerous than anger. It begins with exposure. The kind that does not scream but quietly dismantles everything built on half-truths. Because for years, viewers of Sister Wives have sensed that the real tension in this family was never just emotional, it was financial, it was about control, and it was about who really knew what was happening behind closed doors. What you are about to hear is not a rumor-filled rant or exaggerated fan theory. It is a breakdown of how one calm revelation triggered Robyn Brown's most explosive unraveling yet, and why the timing of it all matters more than people realize. So stay with me, because every detail builds toward what happens next. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it for a long time. Meri Brown existed on the sidelines of the family narrative, present but not central, included but not empowered, and many viewers wrote her off as passive or disengaged. But that perception ignored one crucial thing: Meri was watching. And when someone spends years watching without speaking, they tend to see everything. While other wives openly questioned decisions, fought for resources, or walked away entirely, Meri stayed quiet, and silence in a family like this is never empty, it is loaded. Over the years, fans noticed inconsistencies in how properties were purchased, how finances were discussed, and how certain households seemed protected while others were left scrambling, especially after the move to Flagstaff, when the family simultaneously claimed financial strain while securing expensive properties. That did not align with that narrative. This is where the tension starts tightening. Because mortgages are not just paperwork, they are commitments, records, and proof. And when Meri finally referenced timelines and decisions that did not match what viewers had been told, it cracked the illusion of chaos that had protected the family for years. Chaos can excuse mistakes, confusion can justify poor planning, but documentation cannot be argued with emotionally. And that is exactly why Robyn's reaction was so intense. If you have ever seen someone realize that their version of events is about to be replaced by a documented one, you know the panic that follows. And that panic is what we witnessed. At first, Robyn did not explode, she deflected. She framed the situation as emotionally overwhelming, as misunderstanding, as something that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. But the more she spoke, the more contradictions appeared, and those contradictions did not exist in isolation. They existed against years of footage where Robyn was deeply involved in family decisions. Viewers remembered her advocating for specific housing needs, pushing for stability for her children, and supporting Kody's leadership when it benefited her household. So, when she suddenly began suggesting that financial decisions happened around her rather than with her, people noticed immediately. This is where I want you to pause and really think about this, because it is important. Do you believe someone can be deeply involved in planning for years and then suddenly be unaware of the consequences? Or does that sound like someone trying to step away from responsibility once scrutiny begins? Leave your answer in the comments, because this question sits at the heart of everything that followed. As more fans revisited old episodes, clips resurfaced that made Robyn's new framing harder to defend. And the internet did what it always does: it connected dots faster than the family ever expected. What made Robyn's crash out feel unhinged was not just the emotion, it was the shift in loyalty. Because for years she had positioned herself as Kody's emotional partner, the one who understood him, defended him, and validated his authority when the other wives challenged it. That alliance was the backbone of the family's power structure. And the moment Robyn began implying that Kody was responsible for decisions now under question, that structure collapsed. Blame shifting is not subtle when it happens in public, especially when it contradicts a long-standing narrative of unity. And viewers could feel that something irreversible had happened. Kody's reaction only added fuel to the fire, because instead of confidently taking control of the narrative, he appeared defensive, tense, and visibly uncomfortable, which suggested that this was not a coordinated strategy. This was damage control unfolding in real time, when the person who has benefited most from centralized decision-making suddenly becomes the sole bearer of responsibility. The imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. And Robyn's emotional state reflected that realization. She was no longer speaking from a position of security, she was reacting from fear. Fear of public perception, fear of accountability. and fear that the story was no longer hers to manage. This is why the audience stayed locked in, because this was not manufactured drama. It was the kind of tension that emerges when long-avoided truths surface and force people to choose between loyalty and self-preservation. Meri did not need to accuse anyone directly. The reactions did that for her. And the more Robyn spoke, the more viewers questioned why someone innocent would feel the need to distance themselves so aggressively. Emotional responses are human, but patterns of deflection tell a deeper story, and that story was unfolding piece by piece. If you are finding this breakdown eye-opening so far, make sure you subscribe right now, because this is only the beginning, and the next phase of this fallout is even more revealing. As discussion spread across social media, Robyn's image began to fracture, with longtime supporters expressing confusion and critics feeling validated. And that shift in audience perception is something reality television rarely recovers from. Once viewers stop accepting emotional explanations and start asking factual questions, the tone changes permanently. Behind all of this is a much bigger issue, one that has followed this family for years: financial opacity, from past bankruptcies to sudden relocations to uneven resource distribution. Money has always been the silent conflict driving emotional breakdowns, and Meri's comments simply brought that conflict into focus. Robyn's crash out was not about one accusation. It was about the realization that years of carefully maintained ambiguity were no longer working. And that is when people unravel. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something directly. Do you think this family would still be presenting a united front if Meri had stayed silent? Or was this collapse inevitable no matter what? Answer that below, because your perspective matters. And it shapes how stories like this are interpreted as we move into the next part. Everything escalates, emotions intensify, alliances fracture further, and the consequences become impossible to contain, so stay with me, because what happens next explains why this moment may have permanently changed how viewers see Robyn, Kody, and the entire legacy of this family. As the pressure from Meri's quiet revelations continued to spread, the atmosphere around Robyn shifted from defensive to volatile. And this is where the crash out truly became impossible to ignore. Because instead of the situation cooling down, every new reaction seemed to pour gasoline on the fire. What viewers were witnessing now was not a single emotional moment, but a sustained unraveling. The kind that happens when someone realizes they are losing control of a narrative they believed was locked down. Robyn's words started to change in tone and intent, sometimes framing herself as overwhelmed, sometimes as misled, and sometimes as a victim of decisions she now claimed were never fully hers. And that inconsistency became the loudest signal of all. This phase is important because it exposed a contradiction that many fans had suspected for years, but could never quite prove. The contradiction between Robyn's on-screen influence and her sudden insistence that she lacked agency. For seasons, she was presented as someone deeply involved in discussions about housing stability, family finances, and long-term planning, often advocating strongly for what she believed her children needed. And Kody frequently reinforced that image by turning to her for validation during family conflicts. So, when Robyn began suggesting that financial decisions, especially those involving mortgages and property, were primarily Kody's responsibility, it created cognitive dissonance for viewers who had watched her participate in those very conversations. This is where the audience reaction intensified, because people were not just reacting emotionally, they were fact-checking, rewatching episodes, and pulling clips that painted a very different picture than the one Robyn was now presenting. The internet does not forget, and once that collective memory activated, Robyn's explanations began to feel less like clarification and more like revision. If you have ever seen someone try to distance themselves from a shared decision, once consequences appear, you recognize this pattern immediately. And that recognition is what kept viewers glued to the screen. Kody's role during this stage made everything even more uncomfortable, because his frustration was no longer directed outward at the wives, who had already emotionally exited the family. It was now colliding with Robyn's attempt to reposition herself. His body language, his tone, and his increasingly rigid responses suggested that whatever understanding they once shared was cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. The man who once insisted on loyalty and unity now looked cornered, and the irony was impossible to miss. because the centralized control he demanded for years had left him standing alone. When accountability arrived, Robyn's emotional volatility escalated as this dynamic became clear, and this is where viewers began using the word unhinged. Not as an insult, but as a description of how unpredictable her reactions had become. One moment she appeared tearful and overwhelmed, the next offensive and sharp. And that emotional whiplash created tension that felt unfiltered and real. Reality television thrives on authenticity, and this was authenticity born from fear, not performance, which is why audiences could not look away. At this point, I want to hear from you. Do you think Robyn's reactions were driven by genuine emotional overload, or by the realization that the story was slipping out of her control? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is where opinions really start to split. And those splits reveal how differently people interpret the same behavior. This question matters, because it determines whether viewers see Robyn as overwhelmed or calculated. And that distinction defines her legacy within this family's discussion spread across social media. Robyn's image began to fracture in a way it never had before. Some longtime supporters expressed confusion, saying her explanations no longer matched what they remembered, while critics felt vindicated, pointing to this moment as proof that favoritism and imbalance had always existed. The comment sections became battlegrounds of interpretation, with people debating intent, responsibility, and whether ignorance was even plausible at this stage. This surge in engagement was not accidental. It was driven by the sense that something real was finally being exposed. Meanwhile, Meri remained notably restrained, and that restraint amplified the chaos around her. She did not escalate, she did not backtrack, and she did not attempt to control how others reacted, which only highlighted how destabilizing her words had been. By staying grounded and factual, Meri forced everyone else to carry the emotional weight, and in reality television, the person who stays calm often ends up holding the most power. That contrast made Robyn's emotional responses stand out even more starkly, and viewers noticed. What made this stage so gripping was the sense that consequences were finally catching up to long-standing behavior patterns. Financial opacity, uneven decision-making, and emotional favoritism had been discussed for years. But now those themes were colliding in one concentrated moment. Robyn's attempt to step away from responsibility collided with footage, memory, and public perception, creating a pressure cooker that intensified with every episode and every interview. If you are still watching at this point, take a second to like this video and share it with someone who follows this family, because this kind of slow burn unraveling is rare, and the more eyes on it, the clearer the patterns become. What we are witnessing here is not just drama for entertainment. It is a case study in how control shifts when transparency enters the room, and how quickly alliances dissolve when self-preservation takes over. As this part of the story comes to a close, the tension has not resolved, it has sharpened. Trust between Robyn and Kody appears fractured, audience perception has shifted dramatically, and the family's financial narrative is under more scrutiny than ever before. The calm before the storm is over, and what comes next is not damage, control, it is fallout. In the next part, the long-term consequences begin to surface, and the emotional, relational, and reputational costs become impossible to ignore, so stay with me, because the final chapter reveals why this moment may define the Brown family's story moving forward. By the time everything stopped escalating and the noise began to settle, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just another dramatic chapter in the long history of the Brown family. This was a turning point, the kind that permanently alters how every past moment is reinterpreted, and how every future moment will be judged. Robyn's crash out did not end with a single emotional scene or a tearful explanation. It lingered. Because once a narrative cracks, people do not simply move on, they rewatch, they reassess, and they reevaluate everything they thought they understood. Viewers went back to the beginning, to early seasons, to old conversations about money, homes, and sacrifice, and suddenly moments that once seemed minor felt loaded with new meaning. Robyn's attempt to distance herself from Kody may have been driven by fear, but fear rarely produces clean outcomes. And the cost of that move was immediate. For the first time, a significant portion of the audience stopped viewing her as the emotional center of the family and began seeing her as someone deeply invested in control. Until control no longer served her, that shift is devastating in reality. Television. Because once viewers believe someone is curating their reactions rather than living them, trust is broken, and trust is the currency that keeps audiences engaged long term. Robyn did not just lose sympathy in this moment, she lost narrative authority. Kody's position became even more fragile as this played out, because he was left holding responsibility. Without the partnership he once relied on, for years he insisted on being the central decision maker, the leader whose authority should not be questioned. And when accountability arrived, that authority offered no protection. His visible frustration, defensiveness, and emotional withdrawal painted a picture of someone realizing too late that control without shared responsibility is a trap. When Robyn stepped back instead of standing with him, it exposed the imbalance that many viewers had sensed but never fully confirmed. Meri's role in all of this continues to resonate. Because of what she did not do, she did not dramatize, she did not weaponize emotion, and she did not demand validation from the audience, she simply spoke. And then allowed the consequences to unfold. That restraint reframed her entire presence in the family, transforming her from a sideline figure into the catalyst for change. It is often the quiet revelations that do the most damage, because they force others to reveal themselves through reaction, and in this case, those reactions told a story far louder than any accusation ever could. What makes this fallout so compelling is that it operates on multiple levels at once. On the surface, it is about mortgages, finances, and conflicting explanations, but beneath that, it is about loyalty, self-preservation, and the collapse of a hierarchy that once felt untouchable. Robyn's emotional unraveling was not isolated. It was the visible result of years of imbalance finally reaching a breaking point. And viewers could feel that authenticity in every uncomfortable pause and strained interaction. This is why engagement surged, because people were not just watching a show. They were watching a system fail. If you have made it this far, I want you to pause and answer this honestly in the comments. Do you think Robyn's crash out was an emotional response to being overwhelmed, or a strategic retreat once the truth threatened to surface? There is no wrong answer, but how you interpret that moment says a lot about how you understand power dynamics. And those discussions are what keep stories like this alive long after episodes air. And if you are enjoying this deep breakdown, make sure you are subscribed, because moments like this do not happen often, and when they do, the aftermath is always more revealing than the explosion itself. As the season moves forward, the consequences of this moment will continue to ripple outward. Public perception has shifted, trust within the family appears fractured beyond repair, and the financial narrative that once hid behind emotional storytelling is now under a microscope. Even if no further revelations emerge, the damage is already done, because viewers have learned to question what they are shown and to listen closely to what is avoided. That awareness changes everything for the family and for the show itself. In the end, Robyn's unhinged crash out was not about one accusation or one emotional breakdown. It was about the collapse of a carefully managed image under the weight of exposure. It was about what happens when silence ends, when documentation enters the conversation, and when loyalty gives way to self-interest. That is why this moment feels so significant, and that is why people cannot stop talking about it. If you believe this fallout will permanently change the way the Brown family is viewed, hit the like button and share this video with someone who has followed this journey from the beginning, because this chapter may be remembered as the moment everything finally came into focus. And now I want to leave you with one final question, the kind that stays with you long after the video ends. If Meri had spoken sooner, would any of this have been avoided, or was this collapse inevitable no matter when the truth surfaced? Let me know what you think, because your perspective is part of the story now, and as we have seen, once the truth starts moving, it does not stop.